The listing said, shared unit, 6 rooms, communal systems corridor, Threscale Station Block 9. 12 credits a cycle, utilities split 5 ways. No minimum posting required. I took it because it was the only thing left on the board I could afford. My transit hub contract had run 6 months, paid modestly, and ended without ceremony when the compact restructured the outer margin audit schedule and eliminated my posting tier. The restructuring memo was 3 pages long and managed the considerable feat of saying nothing specific while affecting everyone precisely. I had 48 hours to find housing before the station required me to declare transit status, which would have bumped me to temporary quarters at the processing center, a place designed for people between ships, not for a man who intended to stay on Threscale long enough to pick up independent contract work. So I paid the 12 credits, packed my 2 cases and my audit terminal, and walked to Block 9. It is worth noting that I had looked at the listing carefully before accepting it. 12 credits a cycle was, on Threscale, approximately 40% below the station's median residential rate. I have been an auditor long enough to know that when something is priced significantly below its market equivalent, there is a reason, and the reason is either a documentation problem or a condition problem, and both of those are things I prefer to know about before committing to them. The listing had no attached condition reports. There were no recent maintenance requests in the station's open maintenance log against Block 9's address. The tenant history showed occupancy in 4 of the other 5 rooms, a detail because the listing said 5-way utilities split, which meant the 5th room was already occupied, and its occupant was not visible in the register, which is not unusual for certain categories of station residents. I should have inferred more from that. I heard them before I opened the door. Not arguing, not shouting, just present. The kind of presence that fills a space the way a dense atmospheric system fills a transit corridor, pressure before the first word, volume before the first sound. I had the key in the lock and already understood that whatever I was stepping into was going to require some careful recalibration of my expectations about shared residential environments. There were 3 of them at the communal table when I came in. I will try to describe this accurately, because accuracy is the discipline I apply to everything I work with, and I applied it then to the best of my ability. The one at the head of the table was the largest. Velorveth species, warrior caste build, broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested structural engineering as much as biology, the proportions of something designed for sustained physical operation in demanding conditions. Copper-dark skin, close-cropped black hair cut with military practicality, pale gray eyes that registered me in about half a second, and then assigned me to a category and moved on. She was reading something on a flat display with the concentrated stillness of someone processing complex information. She did not look up again after that initial assessment. Whatever category she had assigned me to did not require further attention. The one to her left was slightly smaller, which in this context meant she was still taller than any human I had met in 12 years of outer margin postings, and moved with the specific economy of someone trained to use minimal motion in confined operational spaces. Ash blue skin, silver hair cut practically short at the back of the neck, dark, steady eyes. She had what I can only describe as a scouting orientation, the habit of a person who locates exits and structural weak points before she chooses where to sit. She located me when I came through the door, assessed me, filed me, continued eating without any visible alteration to her pace or her expression. The one at the far end of the table was the youngest by visible measure, though I would learn later that her actual age made the word relative in ways I had not anticipated. Rose-bronze skin, dark auburn hair pulled back with the tightness of someone who does not allow loose things in operational conditions, hands occupied with a piece of equipment I didn't recognize, compact, precisely assembled, requiring the kind of fine motor focus that shuts out ambient distraction. She looked at me when I came through the door with the specific expression of a person who has just discovered that the solution to a carefully framed structural problem is going to be something considerably more prosaic than the frame suggested. I set my cases down beside the door. "Dale Austin," I said. "Systems audit, outer margin contract work. I've taken room 4. The one at the head of the table, Keith, I would learn, said, without looking up from the display. "Room 4 has a faulty atmospheric sensor. You'll want to recalibrate it before the night cycle, or the pressure differential will run 3 degrees low by morning." "Thank you," I said. She did not acknowledge this. I picked up my cases, found room 4 at the end of the inner corridor, and spent the first 20 minutes recalibrating the atmospheric sensor. It was, as she had said, precisely 3 degrees off. She had known this about a room she did not occupy. I filed this observation in the part of my mind I reserve for facts that will almost certainly matter later, and went back to unpacking. Their names, assembled across the first week, the way one assembles data points from a system that is not actively broadcasting, but is not actively concealing either. Keith I. Velorveth, Commander Cast, the gray-eyed one who read at the table. She was the oldest of the 3 and carried herself with the particular economy of someone who has made a long-standing decision that unnecessary movement is a form of waste. She was at the table every morning before I was, and every evening when I returned from the secondary terminal, and in the hours between she was doing something she did not describe and I did not ask about. Myrth Velorveth, Scoutcast, the ash-blue one with the operational awareness. She spoke the least and observed the most, and had a habit of being in whatever part of the communal space she needed to be in before you understood that she needed to be there. On the 3rd morning, I found her standing in the corridor outside room 4, reading a structural schematic on a handheld display. She did not explain this. I assumed it was related to whatever they were doing on Threscale, and made a note in my working assumptions file that the building's layout had operational significance to them. Sale Velorvath, Engineer Cast, the rose-bronze one with the equipment. She was the most vocal of the 3 and had opinions about how communal spaces should be organized that she expressed with the precision of someone dictating a technical specification. On day 2, she reorganized the secondary terminal's processing queue in a way that I initially found unfamiliar and then recognized as genuinely more efficient than my own configuration. She had not asked permission. She had not explained. She had simply looked at the system, identified an optimization, and implemented it in the way that someone with a deep understanding of systems naturally does. They were sisters. This was apparent from the first day, not from warmth, which was present but disciplined, but from the specific shorthand of people who have been operating together long enough that half their communication is structural rather than verbal. A glance did what another person's sentence would do. A small shift in posture communicated something I could not parse for the first 2 weeks. They moved through the communal space with the coordination of a unit that has worked together long enough to have divided the spatial geometry of a shared environment without formal negotiation. They did not tell me what they were doing on Threscale. This did not strike me as unusual. On outer margin stations, people in their evident profession and their bearing announced their profession more clearly than any paperwork would. To anyone who had spent enough time on stations where that profession was present, did not typically volunteer operational context to civilian roommates. It was not a matter of trust or distrust. It was simply that the information was not relevant to the shared housing arrangement, and capable people do not share information that is not relevant to the current operational context. What they communicated to me, across the first week, without any single statement that could be pointed to as definitive, was this: I was not what they would have chosen as a roommate, and my presence in their operational environment was a logistical circumstance they were managing with professional equanimity. This was communicated not through any deliberate unkindness. They were consistently civil, in the way that highly capable people are civil to everything in their environment that is not actively causing a problem, but through the texture of being treated as a functional but peripheral element of the shared space. I was the entity that sometimes occupied the communal kitchen in the morning. I was the presence that used the secondary systems terminal between 1800 and 2100. I was the biological mass that had taken room 4 and did not, as far as they could observe, do anything operationally interesting. I was, in short, furniture that occasionally said good morning and always washed its dishes. I did not take offense. I have spent 12 years on outer margin postings. I am thoroughly familiar with the experience of being the least operationally impressive person in a shared professional environment, because audit work is, by nature, the work of the least operationally impressive person in almost any environment. Soldiers, commanders, engineers, diplomats, they are the events. I am the person who reads the records of the events afterward and finds out what the events actually cost and whether the costs were accurately reported. This is useful work. It is not glamorous work, and it does not attract the kind of attention that glamorous work attracts. I had stopped measuring my worth by whether the most capable people in a room were paying attention to me approximately 8 years into my career, when I realized that capable people only pay attention to things that are operationally relevant to them, and I was not operationally relevant to most of the people I worked around until my findings became relevant, at which point they paid a great deal of attention very quickly. I had learned to be comfortable in the interval. I focused on the work. My contract was with the Threscale Station Audit Board, 3 months of independent review of the station's infrastructure maintenance contractor billing. I had done this kind of contract 7 times in 12 years, at 6 different stations, and the work was as familiar to me as the weight of my audit terminal, and the particular patience required to run a longitudinal cross-reference across procurement records that were designed to be cross-referenced one category at a time. The work involves pulling 3 data systems simultaneously: the procurement record, which logs what was ordered and what was paid; the materials delivery log, which records what was actually received and when; and the maintenance inspection archive, which documents what work was done with those materials and whether it was done correctly. Most auditors treat these as sequential: procurement first, delivery second, inspection as a confirming check. I had learned, after the 3rd fraudulent contractor I found, that the most reliable approach is to start with the delivery log and the inspection archive, which are generated by independent systems that the contractor does not control, and then work backward to the procurement record, which the contractor does control and therefore where any deliberate manipulation will be concentrated. This matters because the discrepancy, when there is one, always lives in the gap between what was delivered and what was billed. The gap is usually small. A contractor who bills large against a small delivery will trip automated flags in the first review cycle. A contractor who has been doing this for 7 years and has a clean compliance record has learned to bill just enough above delivery to accumulate a significant sum over time, without triggering the threshold for automated review in any single cycle. I started noticing the anomalies in the 2nd week. The pattern was subtle enough that I understand, in retrospect, why it had survived previous audits. A single contractor, listed in the station registry as Kethorval Maintenance Services, established 7 years ago, clean compliance record across 4 consecutive review cycles, was billing for materials at volumes between 2 and 6% above the materials delivery logs. The variance was not consistent. It shifted across categories and across months in a way that appeared almost random at the individual entry level, and was almost certainly designed to appear that way. But variance that is random at the entry level is not necessarily random at the longitudinal level. Across 7 years, across 11 infrastructure categories, with the monthly compounding that comes from slightly inflated billing cycling back into baseline expectations for the next period's budget, the pattern became visible if you ran the cross-reference correctly. I ran it correctly. By the end of the second week, I had a preliminary number. I checked it 3 times, because the methodology for a finding of this size needs to be airtight before it goes anywhere. I checked my category mapping, my compounding calculation, my cross-reference alignment between the delivery system timestamps and the billing system timestamps. Everything held. I was at the secondary systems terminal in the communal corridor at approximately 2000 hours on the 14th evening of my posting, when Sale came through on her way to the equipment bay. She paused behind me and looked at my screen for a moment. "You've been running longitudinal cross-references for 4 days," she said. Not a question, an observation. "Yes," I said. She looked at the screen for another moment. The cross-reference structure was visible, the 3 data columns, the variance calculation running down the right side, the compounding table at the bottom of the current view. She had the look of someone with a technical background, reading a familiar structure in an unfamiliar application. "Infrastructure billing," she said. "Maintenance contractor procurement. Station infrastructure, 11 categories." She was quiet for a moment. The equipment in her hands, I still had not identified what it was, though I was beginning to form a hypothesis, was held with the easy grip of something she had worked with long enough that she no longer needed to think about holding it. "How large is the discrepancy you're tracking?" I told her the number. She did not react visibly, which told me the number was not a surprise, which told me something about what they were doing on Threscale Station, and specifically about what they had been trying to do and had not yet accomplished. "What's your timeline for documentation completion?" she asked. "Another week for the full audit record. 3 days for a preliminary filing if the board needs interim notification before the contractor's next billing cycle." She nodded once. The nod had the quality of a person filing a useful data point. She continued to the equipment bay. That evening, all 3 of them were at the communal table when I came in from the secondary terminal. This had not happened before. Their schedules did not synchronize in the evenings as far as I had observed. It was not a formal arrangement. They were simply all there. Keith looked at me with something that was different from the assessment she had used for the first 10 days. Not warm, not yet, and I would not have known what to do with warmth from that direction at that stage. But recalibrated. The way a monitoring system looks different when it has registered a signal it was not expecting but recognizes as relevant. "The Kethorval contractor," she said. "Yes. You have a complete billing chain." "I will within the week. The preliminary number is solid. The methodology is clean enough to file." Myrth, who had been sitting with her arms crossed and her dark eyes on a point approximately 8 inches above my head, lowered her gaze to me. It was a deliberate movement measured. "How did you access the longitudinal data?" "The Maintenance Inspection Archive is classified at Grade 2. I have a Grade 2 audit clearance issued with the board contract. It's in the station's access registry under Independent Contractor Review, 3rd column, Current Cycle Listings." A silence, different in quality from the silences before it. Less the silence of a person who is not paying attention, and more the silence of people who are paying careful attention and choosing not to speak until they have processed what they have just heard. "The materials delivery logs," Keith said. "Specific categories. Which ones showed the largest variance against billing?" I told her. Atmospheric management systems, pressure regulation components, hull integrity sealant compounds. All of them infrastructure categories where the actual output, the physical work done, is documented through inspection records rather than through direct measurement of the materials consumed during the work. The ideal categories for a contractor running this kind of billing pattern, because verifying the variance requires cross-referencing 2 separate record systems that most auditors do not pull simultaneously. Most auditors who review atmospheric management billing will pull the procurement record and the billing record and compare them. They will not pull the maintenance inspection archive and compare the documented labor and materials consumption against the billing totals. Because the inspection archive is a separate system, requires a separate clearance level, and the cross-reference is not automated. I had pulled both. Keithai set down her display. She looked at me with the gray eyes that had filed me as furniture 3 weeks ago. I had the sense of watching a working model being revised in real time by someone who takes model accuracy seriously. "We have been attempting to build that billing chain for 4 months, she said. "The billing records are accessible at our clearance level. The maintenance inspection archive is not. It requires a Grade 2 audit clearance, which is issued only to contracted civilian reviewers under active board appointment." I absorbed this. I have, over 12 years of audit work, developed a certain instinct for the moment when 2 separate investigative paths converge on the same subject from different angles. It usually produces a specific quality of clarity, the kind you get when a cross-reference that has been running in 2 separate columns suddenly resolves into a single line. "You needed someone with an active Grade 2 audit contract," I said. "We needed someone who would run the longitudinal cross-reference against both systems simultaneously. Billing records alone show anomalies, but not the mechanism. The delivery logs alone show materials volumes, but not what they were billed against. The inspection archive alone shows completed work, but not the procurement costs. The cross-reference of all 3 is what produces the chain. And the cross-reference requires someone who knows to look at the delivery side and the inspection archive first, before touching the billing record. Most auditors start with the billing record. They find anomalies but cannot confirm mechanism without the other systems." She paused, a beat that had something measured in it. "You started with the delivery side. The delivery logs are the most reliable data in this kind of review. They're generated by 2 independent systems, the station's automated freight intake registry and the supplier's dispatch confirmation, and the contractor cannot modify them after the fact. The billing records are the contractor's representation of what happened. If you want to find the truth of a transaction, you start with the records the contractor doesn't control and work toward the ones they do." Sale said something brief in Velorvath. Meyerth responded in the same language. The exchange was short and I couldn't follow it, but its register had changed from what I had heard in the first 2 weeks. Earlier it had sounded like a compressed operational language between people who have worked together long enough to reduce communication to its functional minimum. This sounded like something that was being updated. "The board session," Keithai said, "when you present the preliminary findings. 3 days if the board wants a preliminary filing before the contractor's next billing cycle. 7 for the full report. The board chair will tell me which timeline they want when I file the preliminary notification." "Preliminary," Keithai said. "There was no question in it. Before the next billing cycle. I'll file the notification tomorrow morning." She nodded. Then she looked at me for a moment longer than the furniture assessment would have required and said, "We appreciate the methodological precision." It was, from her, practically an oration. I acknowledged it with the nod it warranted and went to make ground seed concentrate and work through the next category cross-reference until the secondary terminal's priority queue showed green. The 3 days before the board session changed the texture of the communal unit in ways that were specific and small, and I thought deliberate. Sale stopped using the secondary terminal between 1600 and 2000, which freed my longest working window without any explicit negotiation. She did this on the first of the 3 days, and maintained it without comment or acknowledgement of having done it, in the way that someone accustomed to logistical coordination adjusts resource allocation as a matter of operational practice rather than social courtesy. On the second day, Meyerth materialized beside the secondary terminal at approximately 1900 with a thermal canister of something warm, and set it at the right side of the terminal surface without looking at me or saying anything. The canister contained a grain-based compound that was not ground seed concentrate, but was warm and had enough nutritive density to function as a working meal, which is what I needed at that hour when I had forgotten to eat since mid-afternoon. I did not know whether she had noticed the forgetting or whether she had simply assessed the operating conditions and determined that a working auditor at 1900, with a 3-day deadline, needed warm food within reach. Either explanation was consistent with what I had observed about how she moved through the world. On the third morning, Keithai was at the table when I came out of room 4 at 05:30, which was 40 minutes earlier than her usual appearance. She was reading. She did not say anything, but when I went to make ground seed concentrate, she had already made enough for 2, which she had not done on any of the previous 20 days, and she moved her display to the far corner of the table in a way that freed the near end for a second person's working space. I sat down at the near end and worked through the final category cross-reference, and we were both at the table in a silence that had a different quality from the earlier silences. Less the absence of interaction, and more the presence of two people doing separate work in the same space, with a shared understanding of what the morning required. At 0800, I filed the preliminary notification to the audit board. Keithai received my system message at 0840. Preliminary session confirmed for the following afternoon. She replied in 3 words, "Understood. We'll attend." The Threscale Station Audit Board met in a mid-level chamber on the administrative ring, official, properly equipped, and completely unprepossessing in the way of spaces that have been designed for functional seriousness rather than institutional impression. 8 members around a long table, a display wall, a podium with a built-in documentation interface. The session was listed in the day's schedule as a routine preliminary contractor review. It was not, as it turned out, routine. Keithai, Meyerth, and Sale were already seated when I arrived, to the right of the main table, in civilian clothes that did not conceal anything essential about what they were to anyone who was paying the right kind of attention. Beside them was a 4th Velorveth, male, significantly older, with the bearing of someone who has given orders professionally for long enough that he no longer needs to give most of them out loud because the people around him have learned to anticipate them. He was introduced to the board as Commander Velthar Orvith, Operations Director for a Sovereignty Intelligence Coordination Unit whose mandate was not described in detail. He did not greet me. He looked at me the way Keithai had looked at me on day 1, the furniture assessment, the category assignment, the dismissal, and then looked at the board chair, which is where the relevant parties in the room were as far as he was concerned. This did not concern me. I had my documentation. Documentation does not require the audience to find the presenter impressive. It requires the audience to find the methodology sound, and I had spent 22 days making sure the methodology was exactly that. I presented. I ran through the methodology first, not because the board required an extended technical explanation, but because a finding of this magnitude requires the methodology to be visible and defensible before the conclusion is stated. Dual system cross-reference structure, longitudinal pull across 7 years, category-by-category variance analysis, compounding calculation applied to monthly billing cycles. 15 minutes. The board's senior reviewer took 3 notes. The board chair asked a clarifying question about the delivery log timestamp alignment, which I answered because I had anticipated it. Then the findings. Specific billing entries mapped against specific delivery log entries, category by category, year by year. The cumulative total, built line by line, the way a complete audit record should be built, not as a conclusion asserted but as a sum arrived at through a transparent process that anyone with the relevant clearance and the willingness to spend 22 days running cross-references could reproduce. The contractor ID, the billing chain. The documentation thread connecting 7 years of entries through 11 categories to a single registered entity whose compliance record had been clean across 4 review cycles, because the reviews had not cross-referenced the inspection archive against the delivery log totals simultaneously. I had spent 12 years doing this work. I was not quick. I had never been quick, and I had stopped wanting to be quick approximately 4 years in when I understood that thoroughness is what an audit finding requires and quick is what causes audit findings to be challenged. I was thorough. The board received thorough. When I finished, the chamber was quiet for a moment in the way that rooms go quiet when a significant amount of information has just been presented, and the audience is processing the implications rather than the next question. Commander Velthar spoke first. The Sovereignty Intelligence Unit's 7-month investigation provided the foundational intelligence framework that made this audit finding possible. He said it with the ease of someone for whom credit allocation is an operational function like any other, efficient, necessary, directed. The civilian audit function provided technical documentation support. The board should record the intelligence operation as the primary investigative mechanism. The board chair looked at him, then at me, then at my documentation displayed on the wall. The documentation was, as I had structured it, entirely self-contained. It required no external intelligence framework to be legible. It required only the methodology and the records, both of which were in the display. The foundational finding, the board chair said, with the care of someone choosing words that will be in a record, is the longitudinal cross-reference between the station maintenance inspection archive and the contractor billing records. That cross-reference required simultaneous access to both systems, which required a Grade 2 independent audit clearance. The timeline on the documentation, she consulted her display, reflects an independent contract begun 22 days ago, at which point the contractor billing review was initiated. The preliminary finding is complete on its own terms. The intelligence framework, Commander Velthar began, is not before this board, the board chair said. She was not unkind, she was precise. What is before this board is a preliminary audit report filed by an independent contractor under a board-issued clearance. The finding stands on its methodology. The full report in 7 days will be entered into the station's formal record. She looked at me. Mr. Asen, the board appreciates the precision of the preliminary submission. The documentation structure is clear. I said thank you. I sat down. Commander Velthar did not say anything further. He was looking at the display wall where my documentation remained visible. His expression had the quality of someone who has encountered a situation his operational model had not fully accounted for, and is deciding how to update the model without the update being visible to an audience. He looked at Keithai. She was looking at the display. The gray eyes were doing the thing I had started to recognize in them across the 3 days of the board preparation, the precise, still attention of someone updating a working model with new information and taking the update seriously. The session wrapped in the procedural language that formal board proceedings use for their closing rituals. Members thanked, record noted, next session date confirmed, chamber cleared. I collected my terminal and my documentation files and walked out through the corridor before most of the attendees had finished gathering their materials. I had found, over 12 years, that the moments immediately after a significant presentation are better navigated by the person who presented if that person is not in the room while the audience processes the implications. The processing is more efficient without the presenter present. And I did not want to be in the room while Commander Velthar worked through the gap between what he had expected the session to produce and what it had produced. I walked to the observation platform on the station's outer ring level. It was 2 levels above the administrative ring, accessible through a maintenance corridor that most people on Threscale did not use because the lift access was on the opposite side of the administrative complex from the main residential approaches. I had found it on my 4th day. Walking the station's peripheral architecture is something I do in the first week of any posting. because understanding the physical structure of an environment is useful to anyone who is going to spend months working within it, and had returned to it several times when I needed to think without ambient station noise. It was a broad arc of reinforced transparency looking out at the transit lanes, and beyond them, the slow, permanent light of the outer margin transit corridor. Threscale Station sits on a secondary lane between two larger transit hubs, which means its traffic is regular and not excessive. Vessels every 12 to 20 minutes during peak hours, slower in the off cycles. The light from the corridor has the particular quality of outer margin light at this latitude, not the deep black of open space, but something more graduated, more sustained, something that the eye can rest against without being swallowed by it. I stood there for a while, long enough for the tension that comes at the end of a significant presentation to work its way through my system and leave behind the quieter state that I think of as the post-audit equilibrium, the point at which the work is submitted and complete, and the evaluation of whether it was correct is now in other hands, and there is nothing to do about it except let the process run. I heard footsteps in the maintenance corridor behind me. I knew them by then. By the fourth week of a shared housing arrangement, you learn the specific sound of the people you share space with, the particular weight and rhythm of how each person moves through a corridor. These were Keith's, unhurried, deliberate, carrying more mass per step than the corridor's flooring was accustomed to, with the even spacing of someone who does not change pace when entering a space. She came and stood beside me at the transparency, not close, but beside me and facing the same direction I was facing. For a while neither of us said anything. The transit lane was quiet between vessels. The outer margin light was steady and even. Commander Velthar would like the board to credit the intelligence operation, she said. I'm aware, I said. That's a matter for him and the board. The documentation is what it is. The board read it. He is not accustomed to finding that documentation does not support his preferred framing of events. Most commanders aren't. The ones who work with audit functions long enough usually develop a working understanding of how the relationship functions. The ones who haven't tend to find the first significant session instructive. A transit vessel moved slowly through the lane, a mid-size freighter, running lights steady, on the standard approach vector for the station's secondary dock. It passed, and its lights diminished gradually into the corridor. We knew Kethorval was the source, Keith said. We have known it with reasonable certainty for 4 months. We had the intelligence framework, the source analysis, the pattern identification from surveillance of the contractor's primary administrative office. What we did not have was the billing chain. Because the billing chain required the inspection archive cross-reference, and the inspection archive required the audit clearance, and the audit clearance is issued only to independent contractors under active board appointment. She was quiet for a moment. We had spent 2 months attempting to find a way to access the inspection archive through intelligence channels. There is no intelligence channel that provides Grade 2 audit clearance. It is a civilian administrative function, and it requires a civilian administrative appointment. You needed someone with an active contract. We needed someone who was already doing the work we needed done, through channels we could not replicate. She turned her head slightly toward me. We did not expect the room in Block 9 to be taken by an independent auditor. I needed a cheap room, I said. The 12-credit listing was the only one on the board I could take without going into transit resident status. Yes, a pause. I should not have assessed you the way I assessed you when you came through the door. I considered this for a moment. The honesty of it was more direct than I had expected, and I took it seriously because it deserved seriousness. You assessed me on the information available to you. A middle-aged human male, 2 cases, an audit terminal, taking the cheapest listing on the station housing board. The category you assigned was a reasonable inference from the available data. The category was insufficient. Most categories are, when you're dealing with data that is present but not yet legible. The billing chain was insufficient until the inspection archive cross-reference made it legible. The category for the person in room 4 was insufficient until the 22-day cross-reference made it legible. I looked at the transit lane. That's the thing audit work teaches you, if you do it long enough. The record is always more complete than the category suggests. The category is a simplification that works well enough until it doesn't, and then you update it. She looked at me with the gray eyes that had been recalibrating steadily across the past 3 days. The quality in them now was specific. The look of a person who is performing an accurate revision and taking the accuracy of the revision seriously, which is different from the look of a person who is performing a social recalibration for relational reasons. You ran the cross-reference on the delivery side first, she said. Always. The delivery logs are the most reliable data in any contractor audit. They're generated by 2 independent systems that the contractor doesn't control. If you start with what you can verify independently and work toward what you can't, you build the chain from solid ground outward. If you start with the billing record, which is where most people start, because it's more organized and more accessible, you end up building towards solid ground from the contractor's representation of events, and the contractor's representation is where the fraud lives. I spent 4 months starting with the billing record. It's the natural approach. It's where the clearest anomalies are, at the individual entry level. The problem is that individual entry anomalies in a sophisticated billing fraud are designed to be visible and below the intervention threshold simultaneously. They're meant to be found in routine review without triggering escalation. You find them, you note them as minor discrepancies, you move to the next category. The pattern is in the aggregate across all 11 categories over 7 years, and the aggregate is only visible from the inspection archive cross-reference. She was quiet. The transit lane produced another vessel, a smaller configuration, a shuttle type. Its arc through the approach vector quicker than the freighters. There is something else, she said. I waited. Room 4, the atmospheric sensor. You knew it was off before I moved in. I had recalibrated it twice in the 3 weeks before you arrived. Both times it drifted back within 4 days. She paused. I submitted 2 maintenance requests. Both were processed and closed by Kethorval Maintenance Services. I turned to look at her. They sent a technician. 2 times. The technician recalibrated the sensor and filed a completed service order. The sensor continued drifting. The replacement component costs 12 credits from the station's standard supplier catalog. The service call, recalibration only, without component replacement, costs 40 credits per visit, billable against the block's maintenance allocation. I absorbed this. So Kethorval sent a technician to recalibrate rather than replace, billing 40 credits per visit for a problem that required a 12-credit part to resolve. The service call generates a billing entry. The component replacement is a materials cost that reduces their margin on the job. A pause. The same logic operating at the micro level that operates across all 11 infrastructure categories at the macro level. It's the same pattern, I said. That's always how it works. The contractor who overbills atmospheric management systems by 3% across 7 years is the same contractor who sends a recalibration technician instead of a replacement part and charges 40 credits for a 12-credit fix. The billing logic is the same at every scale. The record is the same record. I was aware that the block had ongoing maintenance issues with Kethorval, she said. I attributed them to the general quality of the contractor's service. I did not connect the specific pattern of the maintenance visits to the billing pattern we were investigating. You were looking at the contractor from the outside. The maintenance visits look like service quality failures from the outside. From the inside, from the billing chain, they're revenue optimization, maximizing billable service calls against the maintenance allocation, by underperforming on each call to guarantee a return visit. It's the same logic across every scale of operation. She was quiet for a moment, then the replacement component. I'll submit a materials request tomorrow. Below the 50 credit threshold, it bypasses the primary contractor for procurement. The block can order directly from the catalog supplier. I'll note the maintenance failure in the full audit report as a specific illustrative example of the service practice. I know the catalog item number, she said. I looked it up after the second recalibration failed. I could pull the request. Then pull it. File it under the block maintenance account. I'll cite it in the report as a resolved failure. It helps the documentation show that Kethorval's service visits were not addressing the underlying issue. Documented, she said. The word had a quality I had not heard from her before, not warmth, but something in the range of it. Precision deployed in the direction of something warmer than operational necessity. We stood at the transparency for another minute. The transit lane was between vessels. The outer margin corridor light was consistent and even, the kind of light that does not demand anything from you and gives you something useful in return. You will stay on Threscale, she said. It was not quite a question and not quite a statement, the register of something in between. Until the full audit report is filed and reviewed, 7 more days at minimum. After that, I'll see what independent contracts are available. The station board will have my name in the active contractor register after this, which usually generates follow-on work. Our operational deployment has a 60-day extension pending, she said. Commander Velthar submitted it this morning before the board session. Extended deployments under operational mandate require a registered residential address within the station's housing registry. She looked at the transit lane. The shared unit in Block 9 satisfies the requirement for the extended period. I process this information in the methodical way I process information that has implications adjacent to what it directly states. The shared unit in Block 9, 5 rooms occupied, the lease cycling by the month, Room 4 specifically mentioned. The Room 4 sensor, I said, will need the replacement component installed and monitored across 2 night cycles to confirm the thermal seal is holding at calibration. 2 cycles minimum. The monitoring should be done by someone who knows what the correct readings look like. I looked at the corridor light. I checked the sensor on my second day and logged the baseline. I have the correct values. I know, she said. I have them too. I documented them when I first identified the drift. A pause. They match yours. That, I thought, was about as clean a cross-reference as I was likely to encounter outside of a formal audit environment. I'll be at the secondary terminal by 05:30 tomorrow, I said. The full report needs to be complete in 7 days. I know, she said. The morning blend, if you come to the table at 0600, there is usually enough for 2. It was not a declaration. It was not a diplomatic statement or an operational communication. It was the specific, undecorated thing of someone who has updated a working model and is implementing the update with the same methodical care she brings to everything else she does. I recognized it for what it was, because recognizing things for what they are is the discipline I have been applying for 12 years, and I had no intention of applying it less carefully now. I'll be at the table at 0600, I said. She nodded once. She turned and walked back through the maintenance corridor, unhurried, deliberate, with the economy of someone who has completed what she came to do and is moving to what comes next. I stood at the observation platform until a third vessel moved through the transit lane, and then I walked back to Block 9. The communal space was quiet when I came in. Sale was in the equipment bay. Myrth was at the secondary terminal, and she shifted the processing queue without looking up, giving me the half-capacity allocation that she had established on day 2, without a word about having done it, and I sat at my usual position and opened the full audit file and continued the work. The replacement sensor component was submitted the following morning. It arrived 2 days later and was installed by a maintenance technician from a different contractor, one with a clean 7-year record and no anomalies in either the billing or the delivery logs. I monitored the calibration readings across 2 night cycles. I sent the readings to Keith's system address after each cycle without commentary. She responded to both messages with a single word: calibrated. The sensor held. I noted it in the full audit report as a specific resolved maintenance failure, a documented example of Kethorval Maintenance Services billing for recalibration visits against a component defect that required replacement, maximizing billable service calls at the cost of resolution. Clean entry. The methodology was what it was. The record was what it was. The full report was filed on day 7. The board formally entered it into the record on day 8. On the morning of day 9, there was enough of the morning blend for 2, and then enough of it on the morning of day 10 and the mornings after that. Sale on day 11 reorganized the secondary terminals processing queue for 3 simultaneous users, which was a configuration I had not requested and would not have known to ask for, and which reduced the cross-reference run time on the follow-on contract I had been awarded by the board by approximately 35%. She did this without comment, as she did most things. Meyerth, on day 13, identified a second contractor in the board's active registry whose delivery log variance pattern was worth examining. She presented this to me at 0700 over the communal table, with the specific precision of someone who has learned what a longitudinal cross-reference looks like when it is run correctly, and has applied that understanding to a new data set. She had not run the cross-reference herself. She did not have the clearance, but she had identified the pattern in the billing record that warranted the cross-reference, which is exactly the kind of intelligence function that the audit function cannot perform from within its own data access. We filed a combined preliminary notification to the board 2 weeks later. The board chair noted, in the session summary, that the coordination between the intelligence unit and the civilian audit function had produced a documentation chain of exceptional completeness. Commander Velthar, in the session summary, was listed as Operational Director of the Intelligence Unit. My name was listed as Independent Auditor. The record, as always, was what it was. The sensor in Room 4 has held calibration for 61 days as of this writing. The shared unit lease in Block 9 has been extended for a further operational period, which requires a registered residential address, which Room 4 satisfies. The morning blend continues to be made in sufficient quantity for however many people are at the table at 0600, which is a number that varies by day, but has not, in 61 days, been fewer than 2. The documentation on the period after the observation platform I am keeping in a different kind of record, not an audit record, because an audit record requires a methodology section and a compounding calculation and an evidence chain. And what I have instead is something that does not require any of those things because its validity is not in dispute and does not need to be defended. What I have is this. I came to Threscale Station because my posting expired and I needed a cheap room. I found one in Block 9, shared unit, 6 rooms, communal corridor, utilities split 5 ways, 12 credits a cycle. The record that followed from that is the most complete I have ever filed. I have no intention of closing it.